Okay, so we are in the lesson proper, biodiversity, fungi, protists, and animals. I'm going to do my best not to be a reader of a PowerPoint. You cannot see my face this time, but that's okay. I would just like you to focus on the graphics I have here, and we are going to start with fungi. So I asked you to go home, you're at home, I asked you at home to take some time to actually make up some fungi. How are you going to make a fungus grow in your home? It's easy to do. What are fungus in the first place? Well, we have all sorts of examples. And so on my graphic here, you'll see that I have a bunch. We have our mushrooms, our button mushrooms we buy at Sobeys or Fortino's or No Frills or wherever you shop. We also have hallucinogenic mushrooms. So these are the same ones that shrooms that people use in order to alter their mind. This has been something that's been used in the history of some indigenous people for a very long time. Sadly, some people are trying to find mushrooms the cheap way. So they go to a field and they look for these things called morels, and these morels are evidently a delicacy. I've never had it, but I don't see myself paying the amount that they ask you for. And some of these mushrooms that people go to the field and pick naturally look very, very similar to the deadly mushrooms, like the death cap. So here's a sign posted around a park telling people don't pick mushrooms unless you're an expert, because there's a chance you might pick the wrong one and you might end up going to the hospital and getting your stomach pumped. Mushrooms are very interesting because when you see the mushroom above the ground, what you're actually seeing is the reproductive structure. The majority of your mushroom is below the ground. There's these interesting mushrooms that are in Ontario. Look at this. This mushroom is 7 kilograms. A 7-kilogram mushroom. This man found a 7-kilogram mushroom in a forest in Ontario. These giant mushrooms are called puffballs, and they're like from science fiction. You can touch them, and when you touch them, you can watch them blow. Right, exactly. So they're very interesting mushrooms. Now, I just want to jump into and make sure we're connecting to what we just came from. We just came from phylogeny. And in phylogeny, we're looking at the classification of organisms based on evolutionary history. It's classification, it's diversity. And so here we have Mimi. Mimi is a beetle. And Mimi has some distant ancestors from a long time ago. Mimi has an ancestor from 1 million or 2 million years ago that had some kind of major identity crisis, I guess we'll call it, if I'm using a metaphor. An speciation event occurred where one branch went one way and the other branch went the other way. And if we keep on going back even further, you'll see that there are animals that were more distant ancestors along this phylogenetic tree. So Mimi's here with her siblings, and the siblings all have the same parents. But these parents also have other children, and they have their own parents. And if you keep on going back through the generations from 2004 down to 2002 to 1985 to millions of years ago, then you're going to see that these beetles have relationships with many other beetles and many other arthropods and many other animals and so on. And as we keep on going back in the tree, we have this thing called the tree of life. So we looked at this. This is our connection. This is how I'm connecting the diversity we're looking at now to the phylogeny we looked at last week. So this tree of life represents a hypothesis, and it is the connection of all the organisms, all life on the planet, to a distant ancestor. And now we are going further along the branch, away from the bacteria that we've been focusing on for the first part of the unit. Okay, so I'm here in the fungus kingdom. Now, fungus are very interesting. They're more interesting than you might give them credit for. So here is a microscopic view of Aspergillus. And this thing is what I'm asking you to grow at home. And so the black mold spores, if you allow it to grow long enough and mature, you'll see these very interesting growths that will eventually blow and release more reproductive bodies around the environment, and more mold will grow. And there's a lot of science associated with fungi. This is just interesting here, but there's a lot of science. In this one, that person was able to use the life forces of this mushroom in order to make a light grow, which is pretty interesting. They did a symbiotic relationship between the fungus and a bacteria, which is something that happens naturally often already. I mentioned a moment ago how the fungus, the majority of what you see, especially when you're looking at a mushroom, is just the reproductive structure. The majority of the mushroom, the majority of the fungus, is underneath the ground. In medieval times, when people looked at the mushrooms, they noticed it grew in a ring, and they called it a fairy ring. So they assumed a fairy was going to land there or something like that. But what's really happening is that the mushroom reproductive structures are growing, the whole mushroom itself is growing larger, and the reproductive body is underneath the ground. And each year this ring gets bigger as it sends out the reproductive structures along the fringe of the mushroom organism. If you look at the mushrooms large or small, so this is ringworm. Ringworm has a weird name, right? We call it ringworm, yet it is a fungus. And so you'll see it on skin. It's a parasitic fungus, and it preys upon your own body, and it gives this kind of telltale kind of circular pattern. Many of you have probably had it. You took some kind of antifungal, or it went away on its own. But sometimes it can be really bad, and I'll leave a link to a video so you can see what it looks like. So a fungus has a very particular role in the environment, and you should have some familiarity. If you look at the sheet, I've asked you what are the roles of the fungus, what does it do in the environment. Of course, we know it's a parasite and can cause a whole slew of different maladies. Athlete's foot is one common one, jock itch, and yeast infections. We also know that it can spoil our food. It's a decomposer. In grade 9 in ecology, we talked about the fungus and its role as a decomposer is very important. And it's also a parasite that not only attacks humans and animals, it also attacks plants as well. It can, as a parasite. If you drive along the road, and I see some of you are leaving your home but not getting out of your car, you're getting a car and you're driving, which is cool. At this time of year especially, you'll see a lot of fungi growing. A lot of mushrooms are growing around the ground. It's a good time of year for them to grow. And there's this one interesting fungus called the dead man's foot. And it's called the dead man's foot because it has this really peculiar growth pattern where it looks like a dead man's foot, and it grows right along the edge of the road. But there's all sorts of different fungus. Fungus have a lot of diversity. And so these bracket shelf fungi are very common in the forest here in Ontario, as well as some of these other kind of brain network kind of fungi. You'll see them around as well. Okay, most fungi are parasites, and they don't normally harm living things, but there's all different types of ecologies. This fungus I have on here, known as histoplasma, is a fungus that is responsible for many human sicknesses. It actually, I keep on saying that word, I gotta stop. It blows with the wind, these spores, and it gets breathed in by humans. It goes into your lungs. Oh, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? It sounds like something that we have a problem with now. And it attacks the lungs. It actually turns on genes inside your body that makes you sick. We know about some of these cancers we talked about in grade 10, but there's other things that can make you quite sick. So this histoplasma is able to evade your defenses and make humans sick. And a lot of people every year in North America, in the States especially, get sick from these fungal outbreaks. You're responsible for knowing the general characteristics of the fungi. You'll notice I have them listed here, so I'm not going to say them because you can read them. If you follow along with the PowerPoint has what's important. I'm just kind of going over the video lesson with some key ideas as well. The structure of your typical fungi. So this is something I would expect you to know. As we go to all our kingdoms, you should know the structure of an animal generally, the structure of a protist generally, and the structure of a fungus. So looking at the structure of a fungus, it's pretty standard. Every fungus has these filaments. When I say every, no exceptions to the rule. I'm kind of generalizing here. All these fungi have these filaments, and these filaments are what allows it to grow. I'm just making sure I got the right tool here. Is that my pen? Yeah, okay. So I guess I'll use black. And I already have it drawn. So this, okay, I'll use a highlighter. All right. So this, and I'll use yellow. There we go. These filaments, whether or not I'm looking at a bread mold or a mushroom, are the characteristic features of a fungus. And so these filaments have a name. They're called hyphae. Okay? And the hyphae have a certain name depending on where they grow. This kind of pink, whatever color I have here, let's say that represents the bread, and this is the bread mold I'm drawing. So this structure here that goes horizontal is known as a stolon, and we see that with plants like strawberries as well. And anything that penetrates the bread, like we have with these, that goes underneath the substrate, we call those rhizoids. It's still hyphae. So the hyphae that are horizontal above are called stolons. Ones that penetrate the bread are called rhizoids. And the one that goes straight up, it's like the stem of a plant, that is known as the sporangiophore, right? So 1, 2, 3 different names for the same thing. It just depends on where it's located and what it's doing. And at the end of the sporangiophore, if it's allowed to mature, we have this growth. And depending on the maturity of the fungus, it'll be white when it's immature, it'll be black when it's mature and is ready to release the spores. And this is known as the sporangia. Okay? The sporangia are the end of the sporangiophores. It's kind of like a flower at the end of a stem. And inside the sporangiophore, you're going to find tiny little spores. And these spores, when they're released, they are what are going to produce asexually more fungi. Oops, I just want dots, 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 right? So these little spores here will fall out of this sporangia onto the bread, and then more bread mold will grow, or other fungi. So all your fungi have this structure. Most have this structure. There are some exceptions. Yeast, which is a single cellular, unicellular fungus, they don't. And chytrids, I'm talking about them specifically because of their impact on amphibians and what they do as a parasitic fungus. And it's super interesting, okay? But otherwise, the mycelium, the hypha, intertwine into this structure. And depending on what we're looking at, this structure can be large or small. And this structure is known as the reproductive structure. This is what you see in the mushroom. And as these hyphae grow, at the very end, because they're all like they're all strings, right? So this is going to be a hypha, it's going to come through, and it's going to come out like this. And another hypha is going to come through, and it'll come out like this. And at the very end of the hypha is that sporangiophore I talked about. Sorry, the sporangia I talked about. I don't know if it'll draw for me. Okay, so it's not drawing for me. But there we go, a dot. And that sporangia will release a spore. So that's at the end of this hyphae. And the hyphae is what makes up the mushroom cap. And as a hyphae penetrates the bread, you're going to get this whole interwoven mass in the substrate. This might be soil, it might be bread, it could be anything. And this structure in here is known as the mycelium. Okay, that's the mycelium. So you can work your way through. What did I just do? All right. You can work your way through, and the largest organism on the planet is not an elephant, it's not a blue whale, it's not a giant sequoia, it's a fungus. There's this giant mushroom colony that spreads over 9 square kilometers. This is actually an old stat, so it might be bigger by now. And it's huge, it's massive, and it's really old as well. So mushrooms and fungi can grow quite large, knowing that most of the structure is underneath the ground. You should be familiar with how a fungus reproduces, so you can read through that slide. Instead of male and female, we call them positive and negative. And then on that chart that I showed you, remember that chart I said that you had to complete? When you're completing that chart, on it, I'm asking you to, let's see what comes over here. I got a lot of things open, so it's kind of lagging a bit. All right. So on here, I've asked you to complete the fungus in the biodiversity worksheet. And as I scroll over here to the fungus, past my plants, past my protists, You'll see phylum A, phylum B, phylum C, phylum D, and so on. So with these phylums, what I'm asking you to do is you're going to fill in the answers. Zygomycotes, Ascomycotes, Basidiomycota, Deuteromycota, and the chytrids. So you can fill that in the chart, and you can fill it in on the full map. I've given you some pictures of what they look like, and that will give you a better understanding of the concept. Okay. In this course, you should know the life cycle of at least one thing, and not a human, not an elephant. You should know the life cycle of something that is novel and new to you. So knowing the life cycle of one fungus, knowing the life cycle of one protist, and knowing the life cycle of one animal would be appropriate. Again, the animal should be something more complicated than a human. Because what do we have? A baby, toddler, teenager. You're not really looking at much development there. In addition to all the stuff that we've looked at in the basic taxonomy, there's so many things we're unable to explore based on our timing. But on your body, you have other organisms. We already talked about the fact that there's more bacterial cells in your body than human cells. You also have a fungal ecosystem. We call it the human mycobiome. If you ever see the prefix myco, that refers to fungi. Mycology is a study of fungi. So we have this whole mycobiome. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. Generally, there's a nice balance. When things get out of balance, that's when there's a problem. And that's when your body starts to get broken down by parasites. But typically, good fungi will help keep the bad fungi at bay so that you don't get sick and don't get rashes and other weird things happening to your body. So that is your fungi for the most part. You'll notice that I've asked you some other questions about mycorrhizae, and I've asked you some questions about climate change, so you can work your way through the PowerPoint to get a better understanding of that concept. I do want to end with the chytrid fungus. So the chytrid fungus is a particular fungus that attacks amphibians, and it's been spreading around the world for the past 10, 15, 20 years. As the world warms, it's moving further north, and it's wiping out amphibian populations. And the amphibians are like the canary in the coal mine, so they are able to tell us that there's something happening with our ecosystems that we can't see. And as the amphibians die, we know that there's something wrong. And so in addition to all the other problems that humans are doing, we also have this issue to deal with. And so if you click on some of the video links I have, you can find out more information about the chytrid fungus and what it does. That brings us to the next section. So I'm going to pause here.